Hey everyone, welcome to the exhibition results of the Dipo 2021 exhibition. In this meeting, we're going to discuss about the results of initial accreditation. The answers, the first part of it is the answers of the true or false questions. The 10 questions that you answered previously before you watch the debate exhibition, and also the exhibition results, such as the rankings of each teams and the speaker scores of each speakers in the debate. So without further ado, let's just proceed to part one, true or false answers. Cheryl.
Okay, so on the first question, in the motion, this House as UNSC will intervene North Korea. Said opposition is allowed to bring an argument saying that the UNSC would not intervene North Korea because of the China-NK strong alliance that implies China vetoing any proposal to intervene NK. So the answer to this question is false, because proposition fiat assumes that the debate is feasible and possible to be done regardless of the reality that China would likely to veto this proposal. Okay, I guess it's clear enough. Let's move on to the second question. Okay, in the motion, this House regrets the existence of social media. One of the main burdens of team government is to prove why it is justified for the government to ban the existence of social media. Again, this is a false statement, because in a value judgment motion, this House regrets, this House believes that there is no burden to prove why a certain action is justified, because this is just to weigh the harm and of why social media is going to be better or not, why the life is going to be better with the social media. So it would only be relevant if the motion is this House would ban social media instead of this House regrets. Okay, move on to the third question. In the motion, this House believes that US should reinstate military troops back to Afghanistan. The main clash of the debate must be about which proposal is better for Afghanistan, as Afghanistan is the most vulnerable actor in the debate. This is also false, because judges should not assume that the main clash is based on the importance of the clashes based on that depends on how the debate goes. Besides, you can also have other possible clashes that might be framed as the most important for the motion above. So please pay attention to the wording of the motion, I guess, so you don't jump to conclusions. Next is, in the motion, this House prefers a world with one universal religion. Opposition can defend another imaginary world with two and equally powerful religion. This is a false statement, because in a motion that this House prefers a world where blah, 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 opposition has to defend the status quo. However, if the motion offers another alternatives, for example, this House prefers a world where X over Y, then opposition should defend the world with Y. Okay. Then the fifth question, you are judging a debate where OG has laid out many logical premises, problem identification, and mechanization of the benefits. CG, from your observation, only adds examples that support the logical premises in OG. Therefore, OG must be higher than CG due to the derivativeness. Due to the derivativeness nature of the extension. This is a false statement, because you cannot just assume and give automatic superior ranking to a certain team, because you have to analyze on whether the examples that support the logical premises is really important, and it's you have to also take a look at how properly framed that CG brought the arguments and the examples, and it can also be a very crucial addition that makes closing's case is better than the opening. We can move on to the other half of the question by Santo.
Okay, thank you very much, Cheryl. Question 6 is, the motion is this House as the Democratic Party would actively prioritize fielding leftist candidates like Bernie Sanders and AOC, as opposed to centrist candidates like Joe Biden. OG defines the Democratic Party as the Democratic Party in Indonesia, led by Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. Opening government made compelling arguments given the definition that they chose. Opening up, closing Gulf, and closing up define the Democratic Party as the American Democratic Party, and proceed to the debate without engaging in any of the OG's arguments. Is this a legitimate move made by OOCGNCO? The answer is true, because OG's definition is can be considered as a squirreling definition. That means other teams can definition challenge that particular definition if that's a squirreling definition, and it's completely justified by other teams to not engage in the wrong definition, or at least they should not be penalized for not engaging to the arguments within the context of the squirreling definition. If they engage, that's fine, let them be, but if they don't engage, you should not penalize that for them for that. So question 7, the motion is this House regrets prosperity gospel. Opening government brought an extremely philosophical argument about why prosperity gospel in and of itself is not justified. Closing government extends the debate by talking about how badly the prosperity gospel impacts the vulnerable actor. CG says that opening government's argument is not tangible as there is no future impact in OG's argument. In this case, you must give the winning to closing government over opening government. This statement is false. I do, however, want to note that there are many people who says this is a true statement. I think there's a misconception in many debaters that practical arguments should automatically win over principal arguments. This is not a correct statement, yeah? Judges should still weigh the importance and explanation given how each teams elaborate and frame those arguments, regardless of whether or not this is a principal or a practical argument. Next. Question 8, you can discount arguments that are factually incorrect even when there is no other bench in the room that pointed out that incorrectness. This statement is false. You cannot discount a factually incorrect argument that is not pointed out as false. The argument itself does not only consist of the facts themselves, but also some logical reasoning behind it. You can talk about their factual inaccuracy during the constructive later. However, you cannot unilaterally discard this argument because you know that this is factually incorrect, especially when this knowledge is a specialized knowledge that only you know because you have specific expertise on this topic. Next. Question 9, a POI delivered by an OG that strengthens their own argument as well as pointing out the mistake in closing opposition's case can be used as one of the tipping points to decide that opening government is above opening opposition. The statement is true. POIs must be appreciated as highly as responses said in speeches. POIs is also the only way for opening teams to respond to their closing opponents. A judge can make strong POIs as one of the tipping point to put in this particular instance, opening government higher than closing opposition. This is a perfectly legitimate tipping point. Yeah. Question 10 is the leader of opposition and deputy leader of opposition bring two arguments that fundamentally contradict each other. This will imply that opening opposition cannot get any higher than 4th place. This is a false statement. There is no such thing as automatic 4th. Opening opposition's case might reduce in persuasiveness, but the case still has to be compared with other 3 teams and be ranked accordingly. There's no such thing as cardinal sin, automatic 4th. Mistakes are not to be judged in a vacuum. Mistakes have to be compared between other 3 teams in the debate. Okay, so that is the end of the true or false questions, and those are the answers. Hopefully you get all of them right. So in the next part, we're going to talk about the exhibition results. We're going to talk about the rankings, and we also talk about the speaker scores. Okay, so Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Okay, so this is the ranking of the exhibition result. We give the first position to the opening opposition, the second one to the opening government, the third to closing opposition, and the fourth to closing government. I'm going to justify our decision. First, we're going to see what opening opposition brought in the debate. So what opening opposition did great in the debate was explaining the nature of misinformation spread, which is the ultimate concern coming from every other branches about how that is really rampant and super integrated and it cannot be oversimplified. And second, I think they also explain well and how that the alternative that opening government brought is not enough, such as the grassroots censorship, because it will make only people more confused and in denial, and therefore it's going to be more chaotic on the government side of the house. They also explain us the harm about why society cannot afford the misinformation, because mostly there will be demonstrations, because mostly people will be more confused and lose the reliable sources to news and to knowledge, and therefore it impacts the security and stability of society. And this is something that society cannot afford currently. So the comparative that opening opposition gives us is that society will be more secure and stable, and how in proving this, they also have us the step-by-step analysis why government is the ultimate actor to do the censorship, because mostly that the role of government in the society, they have the mandate, they have the moral responsibility, and they also kind of neutralize the harm coming from the government bench, because government bench talks a lot about why government is such an evil actor and unreliable actor, but they mitigate this by saying that government has the counterbalance, and also they mention about how government has the mandate to care about society, and thirdly, they also mention how government has the reliable source of data that is comprehensive and therefore beneficial for the society in combating the misinformation. Here's the comparison within opening opposition and any other benches. Because opening government comes second, we gives opening opposition ultimately the highest position, because OO is better in explaining the nature of the misinformation and its complexity, and they also provide clear direct comparison between grassroots versus government censorship. I think in order for opening government to be on top of opening opposition, opening government have to engage to the contextualization of misinformation that came out pretty strongly, because mostly that opening government brought, opening opposition brought a really deep contextualization why, such as COVID-19 vaccines, if people do not believe in it, that it will be very crucial and very dangerous to society. I think that opening government is better to engage to these points, and then they also can mention about why grassroots censorship such as Trevor Noah or John Oliver would be sufficient to counter all these harms that were tangible in opening opposition side. Also, opening opposition is also better at proving the trade-off and the benefits. It was better mechanized, and opening government needs to have more robust responses in terms of how that the harms and how the alternative can be better under opening government. In comparison towards closing opposition, I think we cannot credit closing opposition as such, because because closing opposition was mainly derivative. The core ideas on how government is a reliable actor, on why government can be a good censorship alternative is something that opening opposition has mentioned, and also opening opposition has been slightly better in explaining the nature and the structural reasons and the mechanism. So we cannot credit closing opposition as much. Thirdly, closing opposition also falls under the engagement, because I think as closing bench, you have the burden to give robust responses towards the government bench, or both opening and closing. But I think the more step-by-step and more comparative and more trade-off was given in the opening opposition, and therefore closing opposition's contribution cannot be counted as much. In comparison to closing government, opening opposition still wins, because first, closing government was quite derivative from the opening government, so we cannot really find any contribution that directly counters and add more reasons why opening opposition was false, for example. And second, I think closing government's argument was less contextual, because it came across as more to why government is evil in general, and those it can be better in providing better engagement towards the contextualization that opening opposition has brought. Although we acknowledge that closing government has attempted to prove, has given us also enough examples and enough premises why government is not a reliable actor, you can be more moderate and you can be more engaging towards the nature of the opening opposition, considering the structural reason that they have brought why they are a reliable actor. I guess that's all about opening opposition. Now we move on to opening government.
Okay, so opening government gets second in debate. What opening government brought in the debate are two things. Number one, there's a possibility of government doing unjust censorships. The reasons are government is not absolutely benevolent actor, because they have political interests that are sensitive in times like elections or to prevent opposition party from rising. There's also a high degree of subjectivity as to what constitutes as misinformation. Certain parties also want to spread their ideology and agenda throughout the society. Like, these are the reasons why this mechanism of censorship is a slippery slope, because the government is claimed not to be benevolent in the debate. Secondly, counter narratives exist everywhere, and most likely many parties will be incentivized to make counter narratives, such as public figures like Trevor Noah and also grassroots journalists. Counter narratives will be beneficial for society because society will understand which one is wrong and which one is right. This is important because regardless of state censorship, misinformation still spread anywhere in private sphere. Thus, society needs to be clarified. So let's talk about the comparisons. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about why OG wins over CG in the first comparison. OG explains better the likelihood of this method of censorship will snowball into unjust censorships due to many structural reasons. The structural reasons are as what I've mentioned before. These structural reasons were not present in the closing government, which makes closing government's case becomes unconvincing as they are not mechanized properly, especially given they try to equate this censorship as those like what happens in China. CG did add the harms of having an authoritarian government and why authoritarian government is an assault to human dignity and whatnot. However, these harms are generally agreed as harmful by closing opposition and to some extent traded off by opening opposition. So the addition of harms is not the more important as to why then this method of censorship becomes a snowball towards authoritarian tendencies and unjust censorships in the future. That's the first thing why OG wins over closing government. The second reason why OG wins is that CG's extension about how government will most likely become the counterbalance of the existence of misinformation can be considered in addition to OG's already existing premise. So OG talks about many actors that will serve the counter narrative, such as public figures, grassroots journalism, that will be incentivized because of this misinformation's existence. CG, when they add the state as the additional actor that will probably counter this misinformation, never really properly frame why their addition of this actor, being the government, being the state, is the best form of counter narrative that exists, and why then their addition is the most important addition given the debate. So that's the reason why opening government triumphs over closing government. The next comparison is that opening government versus closing opposition. So the first reason why opening government wins over closing opposition is because opening government provides more reasons as to why this censorship becomes unjust censorship. CO's mitigation was only saying that government wants good image. However, it doesn't negate many structural reasons provided by opening government, such as the subjectivity of what constitutes as misinformation and how in critical times they want to knock down their opposition. Opening government also portrays that this is harmful because right now society is not given the information they deserve to know. CO does not really engage to these harms, does not really try to trade this off, unlike opening opposition. So that's why the harm of opening government still stands eventually. Second reason why opening government wins is that closing opposition did bring a good analysis on why counter narratives will most likely not work. And it does significantly reduce the effectivity of opening government's counter narrative. What CO did not respond to, however, is opening government's claim saying that misinformations don't necessarily disappear just because the government has censored it. It becomes more underground, it becomes more relevant in the private sphere. And because they will still spread in the private sphere, this nullifies closing opposition's benefit of having less people being persuaded by the misinformation. CO also never responded about opening government's exclusive benefits, such as making government more aware of what the problem really is so they can understand society's mindset, or at least giving people the comparisons of what is wrong and what is right, given the fact that misinformation still spreads in the private sphere. This is what closing opposition never responds, and which specific points that the specific points that opening government's harm still stands. Next. Let's talk about closing opposition, the team that got third position in the debate. What closing opposition brought in the debate is three things. Number one, it's less likely for the government to create extremely politicized censorship because they want good image in front of their society, and most likely unjust censorship can be pointed out as illegitimate by their own society when society compares government's news and international news. That's the first thing. The second thing is that government, in closing opposition, will still create important clarifications for the people, and their clarification will be credible and trusted by the people since it comes from the State Department. Government also still has the incentive to do this because they want to appear as a good government that cares about the spread of misinformation and take actions to it by censoring misinformations. The third thing that closing opposition brought is the people will not be affected by counter narratives anyway, be it by Trevor Noah or the government themselves. If the misinformation has spread, then it will be a significant tool to convince people, because misinformation validates the people's belief, especially in some conservative echo chambers. The second reason is that misinformation spreads only in their particular echo chamber, and the counter narratives usually don't really get into their echo chamber. And thirdly, the misinformation is usually provocative, making the misinformation becomes more appealing rather than the state's counter narrative. Cutting information inside closing opposition means that we reduce the possibility of these people believing more into this misinformation. Okay, so the reason why closing opposition wins over closing government is because of three reasons. Number one, closing opposition is able to mitigate the possibility of this censorship becomes the enabler of authoritarianism, the scenario in which the member of government talks about. Which many of the harms brought by closing government relies upon. Closing opposition flips the logic of closing government, saying that precisely because government wants good image, they will not do illegitimate censorship, since some of their citizens will be able to compare government's news and international news. There is little process analysis from closing government saying that why this censorship will snowball into governments having authoritarian tendencies. That is comparable to Chinese government brought by the member of government. And some of the process has been explained. However, it's explained by the opening government as opposed to closing government. Second reason is that closing government's benefit is inexclusive given the debate. Closing government talks about how government will be more incentivized in creating clarifications and address the truth to the people, since misinformations are already out. Closing opposition explains, though, that it's still within the interest of the government to censor the news, as well as giving necessary clarification, so they will appear as a government that cares to the people, right? Since this is also the general characterization that is agreed upon by the closing government, closing opposition, is that government wants good image in front of the society. So closing government never really compares why their incentive structure is stronger as opposed to the incentive structure from closing oppositions. So at best, the closing government's benefit is a wash, it's a tie. Third reason why closing opposition wins is that closing opposition is better at characterizing how the people will behave after receiving the fake news, completely proving why the counter narratives that closing government defends will never be effective because of the structural reasons that are brought by closing opposition earlier. Closing opposition also concludes that the comparative is better on their side, since cutting off misinformation will at least reduce more people who believe into this harmful misinformation. That's the reason why closing opposition wins. Next. Finally, let's talk about closing government and some short recaps on the previous comparisons. Closing government brought about three things. Number one, censorship is a tool for oppressive government to shut down many forms of expression from their society, which is harmful for the freedom of speech. Case study is Chinese government suppressing Hong Kong supporters. Censorship of social media is especially very harmful because this is the most important way for people to express their opinion safely because of anonymity. That's the first thing that closing government brought. Second thing that they brought is censorship creates less urgency for the government to solve the problem or to clarify what the actual truth and engage in the discussion. And in closing government will give more data and to give good information for the people. The thirdly is that governments are inherently selfish actors. They only care about good image and staying in power. Just for a quick recap, why closing government got fourth is that the harms are unmechanized, or opening government did many of the mechanization for them. The harms, though, are later mitigated by closing opposition, or even traded off by the opening opposition. So their harms is properly responded by their opponent teams. Secondly, their benefits are inexclusive because closing opposition proves that governments are still going to make good clarifications nonetheless inside opening opposition and closing opposition. And thirdly, some derivative content from opening, such as how counter narrative is good and why the state is a good counter narrative. It's not well framed as to why then this is a better actor to serve this counter narrative as opposed to the counter narratives that opening government mentions. That's the reason why closing government got fourth. Okay, so last but not least is the speaker scores. These are the scores that we give to the debaters in the exhibition round. The full range of scores, you can see it in the table. However, as you can see that the range in the previous debate are from 74 to 79. The speeches that constitute from 74 to 75 are those who have relevant arguments, and the arguments are logical, but they tend to be simplistic and vulnerable to competent responses. 76 to 78 are arguments that are relevant, and deficits in explanation or simplistic argumentation are less likely to happen, and the speeches are clear to follow. Those who get 79 to 82 range, which is the leader of the opposition, possess arguments that are relevant in the debate and address the core issue in the debate, and the arguments are only vulnerable to good responses as opposed to like simple and intuitive responses. Like these are the speaker scores that we think are fitting into the exhibition debate. So that's for the exhibition results and for the seminar. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Hopefully this is a good way of learning for your education tomorrow. Thank you. Good night.